Hello, Argent here with a reactionary review of Victoria 2. Now, this is one of my all-time favorite Paradox games. I'd say it's tied with maybe EU4 and Crusader Kings 2 for my favorite one. For a long time, it used to be my favorite one. What kind of happened was it's kind of getting old compared to Crusader Kings 2 and EU4. It uses a modified version, I think, of the EU3 engine, certainly the Hearts of Iron 3 engine. So while this looked really impressive when it first came out, it's getting increasingly dated as time goes on. So I'm just going to talk about the gameplay and kind of how it mirrors real life. So, like all Paradox games, this game is incredibly complicated, but I think most of the basic things we can probably go over. So, for those of you who don't know, Victoria 2 takes place over the 19th century. It ends with the start of World War II. I think the interwar years is as far as it goes. I'm starting in an old save file of mine, as Austro-Hungary, for just because a lot of stuff is unlocked that I can show you. So, as we can see, I did pretty well this game. Let's just look at some different features. So, at the core of Victoria 2 is a very complex demographic system. So, my country is Austria-Hungary, so we have a number of interesting features. Now, for those of you who have studied it all, kind of the defining feature of the 19th century was the global emergence of nationalism. Nations really matter in this game. So, as you can see, we have all these demographics. We have the religious demographics of your country, the workforce, all your population belongs to a particular class, and we'll go into the class structure in a minute. So you have a complete breakdown of that. You have the nationalities of your empire. That's total population, including colonies. So it can be a bit misleading because Britain will only have like 10% British because of all the colonies it has. As you can see, as Austro-Hungary, my main culture is... Actually, here, I'll show you. Let's go to the diplomacy screen. So each country has primary cultures and secondary cultures. So as Austro-Hungary, my primary culture is Southern German. No surprise. And my secondary culture is Hungarian. If I recall, I think Austria doesn't start out with Hungarian as a second. It's a decision you can make. Japan has Japanese, of course, and Ainu as secondary. America is interesting because it has so many. America starts out with the primary culture being Yankee and the secondary culture being Dixie, but you eventually get Cherokee, Texan, Afro-American, Dakota, and Native American as various emancipation proclamations are done, and then France gets French-Canadian and French. So, how it works is if your country has full citizenship, all your citizens can vote. If your country has limited citizenship, only the primary and secondary culture can vote. If your country has residency, only the primary culture can vote, and that can really affect the course of elections. It also affects the rebel system, which we'll talk about in a minute. So as always, you have all these kind of neat demographics. So you can change the map. So like we can see this is Ukrainian, this is Russia in here. Let me just look quick at Russia. Yeah, they have Belarusian and Ukrainian as secondary cultures. So this area here is all Southern German. As you can see, it kind of goes into there, it goes down here. There's various parts where people have immigrated to. If we look at America, which is kind of interesting, we have like Texan majorities in Texas. We have Dixie, Yankee. We have Anglo-Canadian majorities. We have Mexican. I think most of the Southern American countries have their own, although some are like Southern Andean, Plataean, etc. So we have some countries which are cultural unions. Germany is a union of all the German peoples. That's funny, Ashkenazi. Um, so it can declare war without penalty on any country that holds a province that's traditionally considered part of Germany. So they have claims on a lot of the territory I've taken, like Saxony, um, because they are the cultural union of the various German peoples. France is the cultural union of the French peoples, etc. So we'll go to the rebel system because the 19th century was a time of frequent revolution. So we'll go to politics and we'll look at movements. So the game has a very complicated and in-depth rebel movement. I guess I'll talk about politics here in a second. So you have all these various movements. The 19th century had a ton of movements. So you'll have like normal social movements, like campaign for old age security, campaign for workhouse, but you also have all these revolutionary movements. So Poland is, I hold a bunch of Polish territory, so the Polish people within those territories seeks to be liberated. And that's kind of the downside to having a multi-ethnic empire. If you're kind of dissent and you ever become weakened, all the various subject peoples will start rising up. So I hold Ottoman territory. Let's see, is Romania a country? Yeah, so I hold part of Romania. So we have the Romanian unification movement. Yugoslavia doesn't exist, but as time goes on, pan-national movements will come up. So the pan-national movement of Yugoslavia wants to take all of the kind of the South Slavic provinces and put them into one country. And that happens in Italy, because Italy, of course, starts out as a whole bunch of different minor states, but then you get Garibaldi's red shirt rebels, and they show up and they start invading the various countries. And if they manage to occupy a large enough part of Italy, all those countries get annexed and formed into the Union of Italy. So that's kind of how that works. As you can see, we have the various rebel groups. So that tells you the size. That's how many brigades they can form. So we have a whole bunch of different ones. We have communists, we have fascists, we have nationalists, we have anarcho-liberals, and we have Jacobins. It kind of depends a bit on the how strong the rebels are. Really, kind of depends. Fascist rebels are much better than other types of rebels because they're mainly composed of ex-soldiers, as opposed to like sometimes you'll have peasants or stuff like that. So let's go into politics because politics are interesting. So the 19th century was a time of great reforms. Now, as you can see, I've done no political reforms. Austro-Hungary is often thought of being kind of like the last old school monarchy. So you have all these reforms you can do. So a lot of these are pretty straightforward. So we have slavery allowed or forbidden. Almost every country on earth starts with slavery forbidden except for America. And if you ever get close as America to outlawing slavery, then the country goes to civil war. You have the upper house, which is over here. So you can do appointed, you can do 2 per state, which is what America has, and you can have representative. So then we have vote franchise, which we'll go into more detail when I get to the class structure. But you have like only landed, weighted wealth, only property holders. Everyone can vote, but it's weighted. Universal. You have first past the post, Jefferson, proportional. Public meetings, press rights, trade unions, and political parties. Then you also have social reforms, and these are different. So these are things like healthcare, school system, pensions, etc. And these all have trade-offs. Actually, some of these don't. Healthcare doesn't. But like for pensions, you have to fund them, but it increases the amount of capital your lower classes have to spend. So it costs a lot of money, but it improves your economy because the lower classes can buy more goods. Same thing with like a minimum wage, etc. So the more reforms you pass, the more attractive your country is to immigrants. Now, immigrants will not immigrate to absolute monarchies. a couple of them will immigrate to constitutional monarchies. Generally speaking, most immigrants will go to a democracy, a republican democracy. Um, there will also be a bonus to countries which are in the New World or in Oceania. They'll get a huge immigrant bonus, and America gets extra immigrant bonuses and extra assimilation bonuses. If you have minorities in provinces, they do eventually kind of get assimilated. Like, let's look at this province. Okay, so I have Slovaks down here, and they will be assimilated. So they become your primary culture. And people say, well, how do blacks get assimilated? For the sake of this game, just to keep it simple, they treat culture and ethnicity as the same thing. So then we also have religion, and you can convert people to your religion, and you will have religious rebels. So let's get into political ideologies. So this game has a ton of political ideologies. At the start of the game, you have conservative, reactionary, and liberal. And we'll get into kind of the progression of ideologies. So reactionaries, if they have a majority in the upper house, they want to roll back all reforms. All social reforms and all political reforms. If they ever get a majority, you have the option to roll them back. Liberals want to enact political reforms. They want more freedom. They want more political equality. They are opposed to social reforms, though, because they're classical liberals, so they kind of want a laissez-faire, small government. Conservatives want the status quo, but if there's high militancy and discontent, they will do reforms. So I mean, that's all pretty in line with historical. Reactionaries are just kind of blanket against everything. Conservatives are kind of more pragmatic, and liberals are kind of in favor of freedom. And I'll get into policies because those are different. So the next one you get is, and these are unlocked over time in line with kind of the progress of history. And once I get into classes, I'll talk about how each class kind of appeals to more one type of politics. So anarcho-liberals are anarchists. So they want to see social reforms rolled back because they're anarchists, and they're against reforms of any kind. Because they're anarchists, they don't want to see the state made more palatable. So while they might theoretically be more in favor of political reform than not in favor of it, for the sake of this game, they just blanket oppose it because they see it as trying to make the state palatable. So that happens. Then socialism happens, which they want social reforms but don't really care about political reforms, which I think is pretty much in line. They probably would want political reforms in general, but they're more concerned with social reforms. So what kind of happens is when you have these three, the majority of your population starts out as conservative, probably like 70%. And once you reach about the middle of the century, like the revolutions of 1948, a ton of events will fire that give liberals huge boosts to their electability. The liberal parties will kind of surge. They will often take power across Europe and start enacting political reforms. So they'll kind of have their day in their sun, and then socialism will become unlocked, and liberal parties will start to rapidly decline in favor of socialist parties, which is pretty much what happened. You kind of had the high watermark, and then in a lot of countries you had kind of like the classical liberal party, the kind of left-wing liberal parties being replaced with socialist or workers' parties. So that's pretty accurate. So then the next one you have unlocked is communist parties. Once communist parties are unlocked by someone researching the Communist Manifesto, and we'll get to technology in a minute. Once someone researches the Communist Manifesto, they want to enact social reforms, makes sense, and they're against political reforms because they favor dictatorship. So every country in the game, and this is cool, has a normal flag, a communist flag, and a fascist flag. So Spain has become a proletarian dictatorship, so they're a they're a communist government. Denmark is also a communist dictatorship. So they also have that the communist flag. Let's see if there's any other ones. Some also will have like a republican flag and a monarchist flag. But no, that's pretty interesting. So they'll start showing up. So socialism will just continue to gain steam at the expense of pretty much everybody else. Anarcho-liberals never really get that big. What's interesting is actually liberal rebels are Jacobin rebels. Then you have anarcho-liberals. So the Jacobin rebels, if rebels win, it depends on what they want. Obviously, separatist rebels will separate, or if they're pan rebels, they'll annex your country into the pan state. Jacobin rebels want to establish a constitutional monarchy or a democracy. Anarcho-liberals, if they win, will roll back all reforms or something like that. Communists will make you into a proletariat dictatorship, and fascist ones will turn you into a fascist government. So kind of as socialism's about to just kind of dominate everything, you unlock fascism at about the turn of the century, and it kind of saves you from socialism because it divides the socialist vote. So like if let's go look at the overall percentage of the population. So the population, mine I think is more liberal than some because I have a large industry. So conservative is almost always the plurality because the biggest segments of society tend to be conservative. Socialist, so conservative, socialist, and liberal are kind of the major ones. So let's get into policies. So there's 4 axes of policy. There's trade policy, and for that you simply have free trade or protectionism. Makes sense. For economic policy, you have laissez-faire, pretty straightforward. Interventionism, state capitalism, and central planning. So free market and interventionism, you can't build new factories. Under interventionism, you can invest in factories and you can build railroads, but it's less efficient than laissez-faire. Under state capitalism, you can build factories, but capitalists can also build factories. And under central planning, it's entirely up to the government to run everything. Then you have religious policy, so you'll have moralism, where there's a primary, there's a religion. There's a state religion. Sorry, you'll have moralism, then where there's official religion, but they don't really persecute religious minorities, which is kind of like of America, where basically Christianity is their de facto religion, but it's not really specified which form. Then you have secularization, where there isn't an official religion, but the government kind of tips its hat that way. And then there's atheism, which is religion's a purely private matter. Then we have citizenship, which I've gone over. Then we have war policy, where you have pacifism, anti-war, pro-war, and jingoism. So that's pretty straightforward. So let's look at the class structure now. What am I looking for? Here we go. So you have the lower, middle, and upper classes. So the lower classes consist of craftsmen or factory workers, farmers, pretty straightforward, laborers who do things like work on mines, just kind of any physical job that doesn't involve farming. You have slaves, which I don't have because I abolished slavery, and soldiers. So they are the lower class. And you can set different tax rates for the different classes. Then we have the middle class, which is artisan, pretty straightforward. Bureaucrats, clergymen. Clergymen also, for the sake of this game, include scientists and intellectuals. Clerks, which is pretty straightforward, and officers. And then the upper class are aristocrats and capitalists. So let's look at the different class groups, and I can kind of talk about them. So aristocrats start off as being reactionary and conservative. Over time, they increasingly grow liberal. So this is very late in the game, so this is kind of skewed. But yeah, so aristocrats start off conservative. Artisans are kind of interesting. They have no particular predisposition. Um, I think part of the reason why my socialist and liberal is so high is because I didn't carry out any political reforms. It should also be noted, I don't think anyone can vote. It kind of depends on who can vote. Okay, and then we have bureaucrats who tend to be liberal, overwhelmingly so. Generally speaking, generally speaking, how it works is the upper class tends to be liberal. The middle class tends to be liberal or conservative. Once you unlock fascism, they tend in that direction as well. And then the lower class is either conservative or socialist. So once you get the lower class to vote, liberals basically don't win elections anymore, which is kind of how it works in real life. Then we have capitalists, who are, of course, overwhelmingly classically liberal. No surprise there. Clergy tend to be fairly conservative, but I'm kind of in. Clerks are extremely liberal as well, because they're middle class and educated. Craftsmen tend to be socialist or conservative. Farmers are almost always conservative. Once again, this is just kind of. Let me just see who's the most supportive of fascism. Yeah, it tends to be middle class people who support fascism. Middle class and working class. Yeah, like 11% for fascism. Let's see here. Then we have laborers, and they're once again kind of a mix. Once again, this is not particularly representative. They're still conservative just because their soldiers are that conservative. So they normally do have historical parties. Like we have the DNSAP, which I forget if that's the Deutsche National Socialist Workers' Party, or if they're the Fatherland Front, or if they're the Christian Social Party. But normally they are historical. Like Britain has the Liberal Party, Spain has the Fédération Régionale, Germany has the Conservative Party. Sweden has the Socialist Democrat. There's the Octoberists. So that's all pretty interesting. So let's get to technology, I think, which is the other one. I'm not even really going to go into the economics a lot because it's pretty straightforward. I'm just going to show you briefly what the colonial empires look like. So you can directly rule your colonies, although that's expensive and you have to defend them, and people will migrate to your colonies. Or you can set up dominions. So as you can see, I had a huge chunk of Africa, but I set it up as a dominion. So it's self-governing, it raises its own armed forces, it defends itself, it joins me in my wars. So it has African Minor and Southern German. And then normally, if South Africa gets fully colonized, it becomes a dominion under Britain. We still have Transvaal and Orange. British India is kind of interesting. It's part of Britain, part of it is the princely states. China works as a series of sub-states because otherwise China will just steamroll everything. As you can see, a lot of these places are just directly ruled. A couple of them are not, though. Egypt is kind of a client state of mine. So, technology. So this is probably one of the eras where technology improved the most. So we have a variety of things. So they get unlocked by year. So we start off the year. It starts off in 1836 and progresses to World War II. So as we go, we start to get so we get field fortifications. We start to get telegrams. Once we reach about this point in time, we start to get trenches. Once we get to this, we get tank experimentation. So you can get tanks, you get stormtroopers, kind of World War I technology. Let's see here. Then we have rifles, which is cool. You start off with flintlocks. Then you get muzzle loaded. Then you get breech loaded. Then you get machine guns, which is pretty cool. Inventing machine guns actually lets you colonize more areas. Then we have bolt action rifles and modern division. The rest of these are just kind of, there's airplanes, which is kind of interesting. Then for Navy, we get the last of the sailing ships. We get steamers, we get steam turbine, we get oil ships. So that's all pretty straightforward. Now this is when things start to get interesting. So you have various levels of banking. So unlocking levels of banking will help your capitalists to build factories. And it'll also increase your ability to create tax incentivization. You also unlock new types of factories. And you can become the world leader in things. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about the economy. So then we have money, which is kind of cool. So you have no standard. And then as you go, we get like sub-technologies like double standard. You get gold standard, monetary exchange rates. Some technologies are bad, like you get hyperinflation, interest inflation weapon. So this is another interesting one where you get economic theory and critique. So you start off with classical theory, and you actually unlock various economists. So we have like James Mill. Late classical theory, we get John Stuart Mill. Collectivist theory, you get at one point. So you get Marx, Engels, and a bunch of other socialists. Then we get the historical theory, where we get Liszt, Wagner, Bruno Hildeband. Then we get neoclassical, where we get kind of some other guys, and then we get Keynesian economics. Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek, John Maynard Keynes. Then we just have these, which are pretty straightforward. And that's just how markets work. Then we have organizations, started with guilds, factories, all this stuff. Technology has immense effects, as we'll see under industry. Technological advantages will basically make your country. So we have culture, which is the other really interesting tree. So we have aesthetics. All aesthetics does is it increases your prestige. Industry and military decide who gets to be the great powers, and the great powers have a whole bunch of advantages. And once you unlock great wars, the powers will have duels to the death. So we have Romanticism, Realism, Impressionism, Expressionism, and then mass culture and the avant-garde, and then we get like jazz, socialist realism. Philosophy is interesting. Philosophy increases the rate at which your points increase. So we have like Enlightenment, Idealism, Empiricism, Analytic. So we unlock these different types of branches of philosophy, like Positivism, Philosophy of Languages. Then the last one is Nihilism and the Will. So we get Existentialism, Futurism, Quantum Theory. Then there's social thought. So we get Malthusian, Functionalism. Biologicism is actually really good because Darwinism gives you a massive education efficiency, which makes you better at fighting wars. Social science. So you get political science, social psychology, sociology. It's really interesting to just see so much of this stuff. And then the last one, social alienation, unlocks the revolt of the masses, and there is the decline of the West and the lost generation. But it's interesting, just the references they make. Like there's Galton. This tree is very interesting. This unlocks the various rebel groups. So we have the rights of man, French Revolution, ideological thought, which unlocks a shitload of things, social justice, secularization, political religion, hierarchical order, and the chance of all these sub-inventions being discovered depends upon things. Like authoritarianism is more likely to emerge within a non-democratic government. Then we get state and government, where you get all these kind of conflicts. You also get mission to civilize. Then we get nationalism, imperialism, my favorite technology, because it makes you able to colonize more areas. So there's manifest destiny, because you can't colonize all of the world at the beginning. So once machine guns are discovered, you can colonize Africa, so you get the scramble for Africa. But as you research them, there's also negative things. Once you research nationalism, you start to get massively more powerful separatist rebels. Biased multiculturalism. Then we get revolution and counter-revolution, which unlocks a whole bunch of shit. This is what kind of unlocks communism. There's Lenin. This unlocks a whole bunch of stuff. Terrorists, bomb throwers, rhetoric of hate, nostalgia, anti-egalitarianism, vanguard party. What's interesting is secret police actually saves you, because once you start unlocking police state things, you get to start repressing some of the rebels who are basically destroying your country. And then the last technology is mass politics, which unlocks the doctrine of fascism. And fascism and the police state also kind of save you from just being on the huge levels of revolt you have. So then we have psychology, and then you eventually get psychoanalysis. So industry we'll go through last. So we have water wheel, steam engine, steam turbine. We have all this stuff. The best technology is mechanical production. I don't know if you can see it, but like some of these will give you like a 50% bonus to something. Like it'll be absurd. Once a country westernizes and discovers one of these technologies, they get immensely stronger. And uncivilized countries can westernize and they get access to the tech tree and everything. So that's pretty cool. So then you also have spheres of influence. So the great powers can put countries in their spheres of influence, like Brazil's and France's, and they become allied with the great powers, and they also are treated as part of the great powers' internal economy. So China actually is a great power in this. See, Spain is in the area of influence of France. The great powers cannot be in the area of influence of anyone because they're too powerful. So I think that's most of the stuff. Just briefly on factories. So each province can have factories. Let me go to, where's Austria? Österreich. So that's the level of the factory. That's the number of people who work in it. So like that's the largest ammunition factory in the world. So that's 80,000 employees. So factories need capitalists, clerks, and workers. And if you don't have central planning, capitalists will actually build these factories. They'll start building factories and the various railroads and stuff, and that'll kind of get your economy going so you can run a laissez-faire economy. Each class has certain things they need. Like, it depends on the class. So, like, the basic needs they need to survive are just, like, wool, cattle, food. The everyday needs are kind of the things that they like are basic life needs beyond survival. So like coal to heat your house, paper, tobacco, that kind of thing. Then there's luxury needs like ammunition, guns, airplanes, clippers, and the more needs that are met, the happier your population is. And factories also massively increase production. So you can fund education, which increases the number of clergy, and more importantly, improves your tax rate. You can subsidize your factories. So if they're operating at a loss, they won't go bankrupt. There's social spending, which is pensions and unemployment. And then there's military spending. You can also put on tariffs. Like the real life 19th century, the majority of your money will come from tariffs. So I think that's most of kind of the main features of the game. A lot of events will happen, like 3 hurrahs for Germany will happen. Irish independence will happen. Let me see if I can... Oh, I don't have a casus belli. You can... the Franco-Prussian War will happen. The Austro-Italian War will happen. Just all these things will happen. So I guess kind of the last thing is once you unlock, let me just see what it is. Is it revolution? Is it social sciences? I'm just trying to find where Great War is. I forget. Once you unlock one of these technologies, you unlock Great War. So Great War is a war where the powers will fight until complete and utter surrender, and gradually it's set up that all the different powers on Earth will get involved in it. And if one side wins, the losing sides have to disarm and pay large reparations, and it's often like a complete catastrophe. You also have flashpoints, which is kind of interesting. So this tends to happen where you have a population in an empire that's not their ethnic group. Like, for instance, you have a huge Polish population here. So that's a high flashpoint tension. And once the flashpoint reaches about 100%, the great powers can pick a side. So, like in the case of Greece versus the Ottoman Empire, um, the flashpoint will happen, and then powers can either side with Greece or the Ottoman Empire. And what'll happen is you'll have like about a couple months of brinkmanship where they'll try to negotiate a solution, and if that doesn't work, then the great powers will go to war. It's to try to make the game more dynamic. So I think I covered the main stuff in Victoria 2. I hope you enjoyed the review. This is Argent. I'll talk to you guys later.